Hey guys, hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Change Wired podcast. My name is Angela Sharina. I'm your host, I'm your coach, your partner in change, and just a fellow curious soul. Today, I'm very thrilled to sit down with Dr. Anne-Laure Le Cunff. Anne-Laure started her work life at Google. They say one of the best places to work at. And then Anne-Laure did something very few people do. She stepped off the high-status ladder, she trained as a neuroscientist at King's College London, and built Nest Labs, a weekly newsletter serving more than 100,000 curious minds. And she then released a book that I believe is the foundational, essential reading for anyone who is struggling a bit, living in this age of fast-paced change, trying to plan it, figure out the perfect scenario for their life and work. You know, guys, maybe, just maybe, in this unfolding, evolving, fast-paced, changed future, there is no good plan. And Anne-Laure Le Cunff wrote a book, Tiny Experiments, How to Live Freely in a Goal-Obsessed World. Her book might be the recipe you need to navigate this ever-evolving world. Our conversation is for you if you are in transition, personally or leading people through one. We unpack Anne-Laure's experimental mindset, which is about, instead of betting your career or your life on a single big goal or plan, you design tiny, low-risk experiments to figure it out, to uncover the path one step at a time. You'll hear about Anne-Laure's a simple protocol for how to design those tiny, low-risk experiments and how to use this formula at work and in life to succeed one step at a time. We'll talk about mindful productivity, which is about, rather than worshiping the calendar and time blocks, Anne-Laure shows how to manage your energy, your brain's function, your emotions instead, and why protecting moments that matters more than managing your time blocks. If you ever wondered also why you keep procrastinating, Anne-Laure has a recipe to deal with that as well. Head, heart, hand, triple check-in turns I'm lazy into a solvable diagnostic that leads to action. For leaders, Anne-Laure shares a team-ready format for tiny experiments which lead to big goals. Running 30-day lab cycle, for example, kicking it off together. Each person picks one experiment, and then you debrief at the end of the month. Details are in the podcast. Success isn't a finish line. Success in this new evolving era is discovering knowledge one step at a time, and then applying, testing, and figuring out what works better as the future emerges. My favorite idea and reframe, guys, it was in the book, and then I discussed it on the podcast, which Anne-Laure found also very interesting. This idea, generativity. And if you're not sure what generativity is, or generative drive, as they call it in psychology, please look it up with your favorite AI agent. So generativity versus legacy is all about making a difference right now with the resources you have, for the people that are around you, versus working on some lofty goal in the future that, by the way, might never happen and might mean nothing to anyone but you, and might not even make you that happy once you arrive. Right? Or building some legacy so people can remember you for generations after. Like, seriously, in this time where everything changes so fast, you really think that's realistic? But anyhow, generativity versus legacy. If you're interested in this discussion, it's going to be in the podcast as well. By the end of this episode, you'll have a 24-hour self-anthropology exercise to notice what actually fuels you, what has a chance to work for you. You're going to have a blueprint for designing your first tiny experiment to try this week to figure out your personal, professional path forward, and a way to turn uncertainty into a safe, curious learning loop. All right, grab your notebook, your favorite drink of choice. Mine is skinny hot chocolate. If you want recipe, reach out. And without further ado, dive in our curious conversation with Anne-Laure Le Cunff. Read your biography. I'm like, oh, you started at Google and then neuroscience and then becoming a best-selling author, and you have your own entrepreneurial venture, Nest Labs. So yes, first, welcome to the show. And then please do tell our listeners how did it all happen, and how did you end up having such a fascinating journey?
Thanks so much for having me. I started my career at Google, first in London and then in San Francisco. And I really loved my job there. I worked really, really hard. I had an amazing team, very smart people working on cool products until at some point I realized that although from an external standpoint, it all looked great, from an internal standpoint, I'm not feeling that excited about this journey, and it was starting to have negative consequences in terms of my sense of priorities for my health and my relationships. So I left my job at Google, and I'm not necessarily going to walk you through the entire story of my life, but at some point, I decided to go back to university to retrain as a neuroscientist in my late 20s. And I am currently writing a newsletter called Nest Labs, which I send to about 120,000 people every week. And I'm a researcher at King's College London, where I do neuroscience.
Yes, and recently you also wrote a book that is quite a success, and I'm such a fan. Such again a one might say random path. Like I guess it depends on how you look at it. But can you tell us maybe a little bit about those transitions? Because a lot of people I also know from my experiences talking to people, clients, a lot of people are going through a lot of transitions. And they're not sure, if they should jump, they should quit, they should transition because of this exact fact, right? It doesn't look logical, and it doesn't look like they know what they're doing, and they definitely doesn't feel like that. So, hey, how do people take the courage? Maybe, yeah, tell more about your story. And if you have any framework now that you can look back for people to maybe take a few first steps to jumpstart this transition.
I'll give you two examples. So when I left my job at Google, I didn't have any good framework to do this. And so I just quit my job. I quit my job and I said, I'm going to do the next logical thing that you're supposed to do when you're in Silicon Valley, which is start a startup. And I started a startup for all of the wrong reasons, just because that's what you were supposed to. And so I found a co-founder. I worked really hard. We had an amazing mission. And ultimately, I realized that that wasn't, again, what I wanted to do. And I put myself also in a situation of financial risk by just quitting my job, not having a salary, and saying, let me just raise money for this startup. So that's the way traditionally we're told to do these things. Society tells us that if you're passionate enough about an idea, you should just quit your job and go and do it. And I think this is very toxic and very dangerous. And for people like me who didn't know any better and who thought that was the only way to do things, you can actually put yourself in a very dangerous situation. So later on, when I went through another transition and I asked myself, okay, I'm completely lost. I don't know what I want to do next. Now that I'm not on this very traditional career ladder of being my next promotion at Google or building a startup, what do I want to do? What am I curious about? And so for me, it was the brain. I had always been curious about why we think the way we think, why we feel the way we feel. And so when I went back to university to study neuroscience, I did it in a completely different way. So first, I continued working on the side, freelancing and consulting, so money would not be a strain and a source of pressure. And second, I really approached this new transition as an experiment. So instead of having a very linear goal of being successful in the traditional sense of the term, like I did with my startup, I just said, you know what? Let me just explore. Let me find out. Is that something I like? Is that something I would see myself doing for the next few years? And if the answer is no, that's okay. That's not
Mhm.
failure. That's just me figuring out more about myself and more about what I want my career to look like. So completely different approach, a framework that is really based on an experimental mindset where you're just trying to figure it out.
Yes. Thank you for sharing this, this, I guess, context of not knowing and also the tool that, yes, we don't actually that often know what we are doing before we're doing it, before we walked away, right? And then the second part of it is allow or create some environment where you're not pressured to find the answer like right away, but you can experiment, right? In your case, and in case of most people, like have some financial foundation through maybe not ideal work or not something fancy, but something that allows you to like pay the bills and then go and explore and find your, passion or whatever you call it, while you're not worried about, your bills and trying to speed it up to figure it all out. I feel like that is such an important piece of figuring things out, right? It's just giving yourself this, like, I don't know, safer, I guess, playground or sandbox to experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, that's not something we do. We haven't been taught to really approach those transitions in this way. It doesn't help also that our brains are very uncomfortable in uncertainty. And so whenever we find ourselves in those liminal spaces, so that word that really means spaces of transition in betweens,
Hmm.
when we find ourselves in those liminal spaces, we just want to get out of there as quickly as possible. And
Yeah.
it's very unfortunate because of that, we kind of, we leave the table all of those amazing opportunities for growth and self-discovery if only we allowed ourselves to sit with the uncertainty for a little bit longer.
Yes, and as you mentioned, to have this opportunity and allow our brain to sit in that uncertainty a little bit maybe more comfortable, we need to at least not worry about, our bills and every single day, whether we're going to be, I don't know, evicted from our apartments or not being able to take care of our family. And speaking, that we're not taught, we're not given frameworks to approach our journey in any other way. I feel like your book is a great, I don't know, example or a great toolkit to start having this framework or having different approaches, tools, and methods to develop this different framework to approach our journey, not as a sort of goal achievement strategy, but more of a experimental way and trying our things out before we commit to anything. Do you know that your book has a subtitle? Well, the title is Tiny Experiments, but subtitle is How to Live Freely in a Goal-Obsessed World, which for me, actually, after reading this book, for me, it's more about how to find your way when you don't know where you're going.
Yes.
Right? And I feel like your book gives like such a vast and different or very toolkit to, again, approach life journey without having to have a goal until you figure it out. Maybe you'll never figure it out, but instead like leaning into each day or each week or a new thing that you're experimenting with, exactly as experiment, not having to have all the answers right away. And I'd like you to maybe jump in here and talk about what I like the new word I guess I learned. Generativity. It's like almost to the end to the book, but I feel like for me that's where it all came full circle because generativity you compare it to living a life for legacy, right? So could you define this term and talk to this difference that you defined in your book, like what it is to live life for legacy and what it is to live life for more or in this mode of generativity?
The difference between legacy and generativity is about the difference in between the kind of impact that you want to have. So with legacy, traditionally speaking, when we think about the legacy that we want to leave behind, we focus on the impact that we will have long term after we're gone, after we're dead. and how we will be remembered. And this really stems from this fear that people will forget that we ever were here in the first place. And
Mm-hmm.
so to kind of mitigate that fear, we try to do as much as possible to be remembered and have a beautiful eulogy when we pass away. In contrast, generativity is focused on the impact that you can have right now on the world that you inhabit in the present moment with the fellow human beings that are on this planet with you right now. And it is really about trying to make a change as however small it is on the people around you. Something you can see right now, something you can tweak right now, something you can adapt right now. And so having this generative effect around you. What's really interesting is that you can actually end up having a legacy when you focus on generativity. That can happen, but that is not your main focus. It's not fear-based, trying to say, hey, please don't forget me when I'm gone, right? It is
Mm-hmm.
really based on the sense of almost generosity, wanting to connect with other people, wanting to having an impact right now. If that ends up creating a legacy, that's great, but it shouldn't matter to you because again, you'll be dead when that happens. So you won't be able to know whether it does or it doesn't. What really important is the generativity in the present moment while you're still here on this planet.
Yes, it's again such an important distinction, and I must admit that I think even till this point, predominantly, I've been living for the legacy, and I can't say that it's been the happiest part of my life. Yeah, I just have a feeling because what very often would happen is when you're living for the legacy, you forget about now, and in the now, that's when you experience life, right? When you make memories, when you can impact other people, when you can actually make a difference, right? Versus like the legacy that is never guaranteed. Yeah, you might end up making it, but maybe not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I really like how you put it. Your legacy is never guaranteed, but if you focus on generativity and you keep on experimenting, you keep on iterating on your approach, you are going to see the difference that you're making.
Yes. Can I also ask your opinion about, well, you see in the like entrepreneurial, especially arena, people talking about this mission and goal, like I don't know, well, from Elon Musk to a lot of other people like you, it might look like this is the only way to make a meaningful difference, right? And somebody who says like, oh, I had this vision when I was 13 years old, and now I'm building that. But then from my perspective, like, well, that's one person that we know of, right? And then there is like the rest of us who make the world go around, so to speak. Like, what's your take on that? Is there other two approaches or maybe different approaches for different people or different stages in life? How do you look at it?
Linear goals can actually work really well if you already have a very clear vision of what
Mm-hmm.
you want to achieve and where it is a matter of just working really hard to get there. And there are very few things in life like this. They do exist, but there are very few things like that in life. And so if there's something that you just want to achieve, I have a friend, for example, who he did, how is it called? It's called the Enduroman. He basically, I think it was running from London to the Channel Sea and then swimming across the Channel Sea and then biking from there to Paris. I, that kind of linear goal basically was first him saying, I'm going to do that. And second,
Mm-hmm.
training really, really, really hard to get there. And there was a training plan. He just had to do it. And his coach was just telling him, this is what you wake up every morning, and for 3 months, this is what your day is going to look like. So that's great for that kind of linear goal where there is a very binary definition of success. Either
Mm-hmm.
you do manage to get to Paris from London or you don't,
Yeah.
right? But most things in life are not like that. There's no binary definition of success. There's no crossing a finish line. And we artificially create those finish lines in the way we think about success. When in reality in life, success should be more about learning something new, the discovery process. If you do something and by the end of conducting this experiment, you've generated new knowledge, that should be considered success. Second, in most cases in life, you actually don't really know exactly what you want or where you're going. You just have a general sense of direction. And
Yeah.
this is what makes life fun and exciting and feel like an adventure. So I would say that it's not that linear goals are bad. It's just that we take this very specific mode of being and mode of doing, and we try to apply it to everything in life. And I do think that in most situations in life and in most areas of your life where you want to grow and you don't know exactly what that looks like, it's better to go through cycles of experimentation rather than saying, this is my goal, this is the finish line, and this is where I want to go.
Yeah. Yeah, like it sounds like such a common sense thing to say, but in yet our maybe like the whole world is not built for that. Like what I mean is, for example, in a workplace, right? Most of the time, like, well, what it is you want to do? Where do you see yourself in 5 years, right? What position do you want to apply for? And how are you going to contribute that to like value in the next 3, 5 years or 10 years? And very often people just invent stuff because they feel like they have to say something. And then after they might get it, they have to sort of leave that for the next few years, right? And very often feeling unhappy and burning out because now they have to like fulfill that because they have expectations on them. But that being said, going back to more experimental way of approaching things, what are some of the practices that you found work for you and for all the people that you worked with, interacted with? What are some of the practices that can help people to start approaching their life in this way?
So I know when people hear about developing an experimental mindset and running tiny experiments, they might get excited and they just want to start and design their first tiny experiment straight away. But I always tell them, hold on for a second, because any good experiment always starts with observation. This is how
Hmm.
scientists design experiments. They just don't go and write random protocols, right? They have a phase of observation where they just try to understand what is the current situation so they can
Hmm.
design an interesting experiment around a hypothesis that actually makes sense. So this is what I recommend doing for anyone who's interested in experimenting and designing their first tiny experiment is to spend 24 hours just observing your own life, observing your own work. And I call this exercise self-anthropology because it's
Hmm.
really about pretending that you are an anthropologist, but with your own life and work as your topic of study. And the reason why I chose the anthropologist as a metaphor here is that the way an anthropologist works, they go in the field, they bring their field notes, and they just observe and they capture what they see. But there is no judgment, there is no problem solving at this stage. They're really just observing. So do that for 24 hours, and you can do that in the notes on your phone. You can do that anywhere that makes sense for you. And it's really about capturing little observations like, huh, I really enjoyed that meeting. Or, oh, funny how anytime I talk to this colleague, I feel really energized. Or, oh, anytime someone mentions this topic, I get curious and I want to learn more. Or the opposite, right? Like, oh, I was stuck in that meeting and I
Hmm.
just wanted to leave and I just wanted to go and hide in a corner. All of these are interesting observations. And I guarantee that if you spend 24 hours doing this self-anthropology exercise, you will start noticing things that you've been doing in a kind of automatic way on autopilot, where you've been just going through the motions. And this is where you can start planting the seed of an experiment, saying, okay, that's how I've been doing things. Could I do them a little bit differently? Or, oh, I'm curious about this. Could I get
Hmm.
experiment around that? And this is the first step to designing a tiny experiment. Observation first, capturing field notes.
Yes, it's Makes so much sense, right? Before you can experiment, what are you going to experiment with? And instead of setting a goal, maybe like, okay, let me see what I love doing. It reminds me also of like when I studied my daily blog, I'm like, what I enjoy doing? Well, writing. And I really miss when I didn't have it. Maybe I should just make it a practice and see where that goes. Right?
Exactly. Observation first. And then the second practice is the tiny experiment itself. And for that as well, I have a very simple approach. So going back to how scientists design experiments, because that's what tiny experiment is inspired from. A scientist, when writing a protocol, only needs two things. The first one is what they're going to test, and the second one is the trial period. And that's it. So it's the same with the tiny experiment. You need to know what you're going to test, the action, and for how long, the duration, action and duration. And so a tiny experiment follows this very simple format. I will action for duration.
Mm-hmm.
And the book is called Tiny Experiments, tiny, because I highly recommend that the first time you do an experiment, you keep it tiny, keep it short. Don't go for a 1 year experiment when you've never tried that thing before. So pick something, pick an action, and do it for a specific duration. And you can do that for any area of your life or work. So you could say, I will not bring my phone in my bedroom in the evening for 5 days. I will block the first hour in morning to journal and read and not check my emails for 5 days. I will close my laptop by 6 p.m. every day for 2 weeks. I will action for duration. And it works for literally anything you're curious about, anything you want to experiment with.
You know what I wanted to ask you here is, again, back to the workplace, because I also spent quite some time there, like working with people. How can maybe leaders take this approach and apply it to their teams, like workplace, maybe entire organization, so people could also experiment with different stuff before figuring out where it is they want to go in the company, right? And so the leader has more chance to put people in places where they sort of come alive more easier and more engaged.
Yeah, this reminds me of what we had at Google with the 20% projects where people could use 20% of their time to experiment with
Yeah.
something they were interested in. And people might know that that's how Gmail was born. It was born out of one of those 20% projects. And so, in a very similar way, a leader can encourage their teams to run tiny experiments. And you can actually do that together. So a
Mm-hmm.
way I'm doing it when working with organizations, which is very simple and everybody loves it, is basically having a kickoff meeting. And it's just like a lab meeting. Everybody comes together and you use the tools in the book to come up with your tiny experiment. Everybody comes up with their own action that makes sense for them.
Mm-hmm.
But the entire team has the same duration. So this is how it comes together. So then
Mm-hmm.
everybody on the team says, okay, here's my action. I will, maybe it will be an experiment in social media, in creative project, or even the way you do outreach for sales. It can be literally anything you want to experiment with. I will, my action
Yeah.
for this duration. And usually I tend to tell people that 1 month is good for a tiny experiment as a team. So you have time to really try it. And then, just like in a lab, you have a debrief meeting. And
Mm-hmm.
everybody comes and says, I finished my experiment. The duration is over. And here's what I learned. The really,
Mm-hmm.
really important part here as a leader is to make it very clear to your team that there is no binary definition of success and failure here. You're not trying to achieve something, you're just trying to learn something new. So, success is being able to join that debrief meeting and say, hey, I did that, and this is what I learned. And if what you learned is, hey, everybody, don't do this, it doesn't work, it's awful, that is also very useful information for the rest of the team. So as long as you have new knowledge to share with the team at the end of the experiment, that is success.
Yeah, I feel also that that is such a useful framework for a lot of leaders, especially now when like so many things are uncertain and evolving rapidly, right? And leaders are afraid to like commit to things. So don't commit, right? Like run a bunch of experiments, like in whatever way and form it works. And that's how you'll get a lot more data than just committing to one thing and running for a year and then it doesn't work out because, it's not based on anything or something evolved too fast. So yeah, I feel like that is also so applicable, not just to personal lives where again, also things are happening so fast, but also for organizations and leaders and innovation. And uh, yeah, it's such a useful framework. Just wanted to emphasize that can be useful not just in personal life, but also in the workplace and innovation of any kind. Uh, you also, started talking about not having to have a definition for success as a key idea. And I believe that is also so important on a personal level to approach this as an experiment with no success or failure criteria, but as exploration. And then having the practice of reflection, right? And noting or capturing somehow your lessons so you have something to work with at the end of experiments. Close to that idea, I think what I would like you to talk more about is mindful productivity, which you have that seems like the whole community about, and which is something you're really passionate about. So can you explain to people what is the difference between mindful productivity? Because I feel like it's very related, and productivity as it's usually defined, and maybe if it aligns there, like talk about the different kinds of times, and also procrastination. I love your idea, like of procrastination is not something negative, but more something to learn from.
So the traditional definition of productivity is usually based on managing your time. And so you have your calendar, you have your to-do list, and you're trying to be as efficient as possible. Mindful productivity considers that time is a resource, sure, but it's not the most important resource. The most important resources that you have at your disposal are your energy, your executive function, and managing your emotions. If
Mhm.
you're able to manage those three kinds of resources effectively, this is what is going to make you feel more productive, be more productive, more performant without sacrificing your mental health. And you asked me about the two different definitions of time as well as procrastination. So I'm just going to start with the two definitions of time. In the book, I explain that the ancient Greeks actually had two words for time. One of them, chronos, is the one that gave us chronometer and a bunch of other words. This is where our society kind of defines their relationship to time around. It's a quantitative perspective of time, where it's the time of minutes, of hours, of weeks, of years. And again, it's this idea that each block of time in your calendar is something you should be using as effectively as possible in order to not waste any time. The other word they had, kairos, is a qualitative definition of time. It's the time of watching a beautiful sunset with a friend, or reading a bedtime story to your child, or losing yourself in a very deep conversation with a friend. And it really acknowledges the fact that time is elastic. It's not a series of identically sized boxes. It can expand. It can also feel very short. It can go very quick. And so mindful productivity, instead of managing time in a very rigid way, see it as something that's very malleable. And
Mhm.
again, if you manage mindfully your energy, your executive function, and your emotions, you're going to make the most of your time, not in a quantitative way, but in a qualitative way with a lot of depth to your experience, which ultimately is what you want out of life. And the last part of your question was around procrastination. So also linked to this idea of mindful productivity is our relationship to procrastination. Again, traditionally, what we've been taught is that if you're procrastinating, you're being lazy, you should use your willpower, you should push through and get the thing done. But procrastination is just a signal from your brain. It's your brain trying
Mm-hmm.
to tell you that something is not quite right. And so instead of trying to push through and suffer in the process, you can look at it a little more like a scientist. You can get curious about it and you can say, hey, why am I procrastinating? What is my procrastination trying to tell me? In the book, I have a very simple tool that I call the triple check that
Mm-hmm.
allows you to have this little conversation with your procrastination and essentially asking whether the problem is coming from a rational side of things, from an emotional side of things, or from a practical side of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so many things because I ask such a multifaceted question. And that triple check, I actually really love this idea about that because again, so many people struggle with procrastination to the point that they think that, they're lazy or insufficient in some way. And I love this triple check because it allows to sort of break down this like feeling or not being able to do what you said to yourself you should be doing, right? So it breaks it down and it allows to explore like this different part of what we call procrastination, and then allows you to uncover like what's the reason and what's the best way to deal with that. Can you explain what's this like triple check model for working with your procrastination?
So essentially, what you want to ask is whether your procrastination is coming from the head, from the heart, or from the hand. So if it's coming from the head, it means that at a rational level, you're not fully convinced you should be working on this task in the first place. That means that maybe that task has become outdated or someone asked you to do it, but you don't think it makes sense based on the overall aims of the company. It's not aligned with your values. There might be a bunch of different reasons why this task just doesn't make sense. And you might not be conscious of that fact, but you still know that deep down. And that's why you're procrastinating. If the
Mm.
problem is coming from the heart, it means that at an emotional level, you don't feel like this is going to be fun. This doesn't feel very exciting to do. And so there's resistance and you procrastinate. If the problem is coming from the hand, it means that at a practical level, you don't believe that you have the right skills or the right tools or the right support network in order to complete the task. And so you procrastinate. And the great thing about having this systematic approach to exploring why you're procrastinating is that then you can also be systematic in the way you figure out a solution to get unstuck and move forward. So if the problem is coming from the head, so you can go back to the drawing board, go back to the strategy. You can tell your team, hey, I've been procrastinating on this thing for the past week, and it's because I don't think this is the right approach. Can we
Mm-hmm.
maybe brainstorm together a better approach? Or maybe you figure out that you're not the right person to do it, so you can delegate, or maybe just give it to AI to do because you don't feel like you're the right person to do it and you want to free up that time to do something more creative. So that's if the problem is coming from the head. If the problem is coming from the heart, then make it fun, make it more enjoyable. And that might mean grabbing your favorite colleague to do a little co-working session or going to your favorite coffee shop to do that thing. And if the problem is coming from the hand, then raise that hand, ask for help. So that
Yeah.
could be coaching, that could be mentoring, that could be taking an online course, that could be just, again, grabbing a colleague and say, hey, it's my first time trying this thing. I know you've done this 1,000 times. Do you mind walking me through it? And that's it. Ask for help. And so, as you can see, when you start getting curious about your own resistance, it removes the self blame. It also removes that kind of need we put on ourselves, that pressure we put on ourselves to just push through and suffer. And instead, we get curious and we learn more about ourselves in the process.
Yes, and I feel like once you understand the reason, as you said, you can work with that so much more productively. And even sometimes, like a lot of people might say, well, I'm in my workplace, I can't really choose what or how I do things. Sometimes you just have to do them. Well, I would also say if you know the reason, at least then you can rationalize it to yourself. Well, this is the situation, right? Let's make it more enjoyable. I don't know, put on some music and get through this stuff because there is no, way of avoiding it, and then we'll have to go through it anyhow. But at least we know like why it is that we are procrastinating, not because we are bad people or something wrong with us, but because of this other reason. So I felt like that was such also a powerful idea to explore your procrastination versus just trying to somehow fix it blindly. And I think the next, stop that I'd like to go is that's the actually interesting part. You mentioned, this energy management, managing your executive function and your emotions. Could you speak more to that? Because I feel like when we're trying to manage our time, we so often forget that how we manage those three things actually define like what kind of quality we have in that time, right? And many people just focus on the time or what to put on their calendar without thinking about like, am I in a good state for that? Or do I have enough energy to even enjoy that, right? Could you speak more, like how did you learn about that? Maybe how you apply it in your life and what it is? How can people use it?
I think, yeah, we've all experienced that, right? You did such a good job time blocking. Then the time block is the moment of actually doing that work, and you don't have any energy or you don't feel excited at all about working on this particular task. And so, what's the use of blocking your time if you're not actually then able to use that time to do the thing you wanted to do? So, that's why I think it's really important to get to know how your energy works, how your executive function works, how your emotions work. And so a little tool that I recommend using in the book is what I call a Kairos ritual. And it's a very simple way to reconnect with yourself, to open those magic windows of creative flow where your energy is going to be aligned with your executive function and with emotions. And those are very different for everyone. So you can experiment with figuring out what that is. For some people, it's just taking the time to make a really nice cup of tea before you start your work. For other people, it's a little stretch. For me, if I feel like I'm sitting in front of my computer trying to start something and it's just hard to get in there, I'm not talking about full-blown week-long procrastination here. I'm just talking about this little resistance. I will have a playlist for this. I will put on some music. I will get up and I will dance for a couple of minutes in my living room, get my blood flow going, and then I'll get back to the task. And so it can be literally anything. You can try different things, but really knowing that being productive is not just about blocking time, sitting down, and getting the thing done. We're not robots. It doesn't work like
Yeah.
that. And in addition, so that was more of at a micro level, but at a macro level, just taking notes, paying attention to what works and what doesn't for you. If you keep on using your ritual and you notice that every time you try to sit down to do something at the beginning of the afternoon, and it's just so hard to get started every single time. And so your Kairos ritual is more of a band-aid that you put on the problem and not really fixing the underlying issue. Then it might be worth experimenting with the way you organize your tasks, again, based on that energy, executive function, and emotion. So you might move that kind of tasks a bit earlier in the morning. Or if you're one of the people who have this sudden new surge of energy in the evening and you can do that and you have free time at that moment, maybe you want to move those tasks here. So keep on experimenting, keep on paying attention. Know that something that worked for you for 3 years might stop working all of a sudden because you keep on changing, your body changes, your brain changes, your circumstances change. And so, just like a scientist, keep on
Mhm.
observing, keep on iterating, keep on running experiments, and really listen to yourself.
Yes, and I love how in the book again you bring all these different ideas from neurobiology and how our brain operates at different times of the day and your energy cycles, but then also the more systematic approach to experiments and figuring things out. And then also, the whole book is about how to I guess, work with others to amplify all of those things, be better at experimenting and learning and shipping your work. We can't, talk about the whole book, like we'll take probably the whole day to break it all down. But could you maybe talk to this part of the book, to the social part? Because I believe it's such a huge part of the book, and we're such social creatures, but we often don't talk about how you talked in the book and using it in a more strategic way to figure things out and you get better at learning and create amazing work. Like, could you speak to that in whichever way works?
Yes, this temptation when we want to be productive to say, I'm just going to do it on my own. This is going to be faster. But there's lots of research showing that in the long run, we are actually more productive, more creative if we collaborate with others, if we tap in that collective intelligence and that collective curiosity. And so I have a section of the book that is dedicated to those ideas. In particular, I talk about a research concept that I think is fascinating and that hasn't had as much kind of visibility than other concepts. So most people, I think, at this stage know about flow states, getting in the flow, like when you're in the zone, right? But most of the research that's been conducted and talked about is about individual flow states, when you get in the flow on your own. There is, however, research about social flow. So, showing how, when you are surrounded with people who are also highly focused on a task, who are exploring, pushing themselves, and trying to grow, this is going to have an impact on your own flow states as well. And so, the encouragement really is to surround yourself with fellow experimentalists, fellow explorers, fellow adventurers, the kind of people who also like experimenting, taking those small risks, learning new things, and then sharing them with others. As a leader as well, it is an encouragement to support your team in having this psychological safety where it is okay to experiment together, really creating that space for team experimentation.
Yes, the flow states and experimentations, like having more ideas together that we would have individually. It's such a powerful idea. And I also think, that you talk about that in the book, that group genius, so to speak, can be used for accountability, where we individually, so to speak, fail to do something, right? We do so much more with others and for others when we are seen than we do by ourselves. And then also this idea that you also talk about in the book about collective genius, how by like just being exposed to other people, having conversations and learning together, right? To working together, your work becomes so much richer. And you mentioned in the book like how scientists make discoveries, together and how they like build on each other's knowledge and solve problems together. Can you maybe share a few stories from your life? Because somehow I didn't ask so much about your journey, but I feel like people can relate to that so much more, where you used also collective intelligence or genius for your work or to get things done, to work on your business and other ideas. Could you tell a little bit about like how you use it in your personal life?
My entire work is based on learning in public. I'm very transparent with everything I do, and I have benefited so much from the collective intelligence of the Nest Labs community. So the newsletter itself is a very transparent process. I post about things that I'm thinking about writing about. I get feedback. I encourage people to respond to the newsletter and let me know what they think. I incorporate some of the ideas. My book itself, Tiny Experiments, was a very collaborative process. So I had polls in my newsletter where people voted on the title. I also shared the book covers. We had 21 options for the cover that I shared with the Nest Labs community and where everybody provided their ideas and feedback. I did workshops while writing the book so I could actually test the ideas in real time instead of writing it on my own. And the reason why I'm sharing this example is because writing a book is quintessentially the kind of like the ultimate kind of creative project where you would expect an author to do it on their own.
Yeah.
We have romanticized this idea of the writer in a cabin in the woods,
Yeah.
just writing on their own. But even for something that is considered the result of individual creativity, like a book, you can actually tap into collective intelligence and curiosity by learning in public and really harnessing those ideas, this creativity, and all of those different perspectives to craft a better book.
Yeah. Plus, if you ask people, there is bigger chance that people would read what you write because it resonates with them more, right? And I think we just don't talk so much about that. But like the one book I remember, The Martian, right? It was first a blog, and I think everyone was like voting on different chapters or something else, and then it got into this very popular movie. And then many authors actually these days to switch to this model of first writing a blog and then sending it to a selected group of readers and then asking their opinions and then testing all the book covers and the titles, etc., with people. So, and then it becomes success. Whereas like so many people think it just, yes, like you said, a writer sit in a cabin and just came up like from the universe with all this stuff, right? In one stroke, wrote it and then shipped it, and it was a success, which I feel is so damaging to just then people trying to actually do something on their own and not always succeeding, and they think that they're just not capable of that. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The to be conscious of your time and respectful to your time. I know again you have a lot of project to get to. I'd like to wrap it up and maybe ask you, as a conclusion, to share some ideas that, or an idea that I haven't asked you about, but you feel like is so important and listeners on this podcast should definitely know about from this conversation.
I think I'll just leave the listeners with a little question to think about. So, based on our entire conversation, everything we discussed today, what would be your first tiny experiment?
Such a great question. Yeah. Like what maybe perked your, I don't know, interest or curiosity, right? As you said, like might be your part of your field notes. Like what you get curious about, just lean into that and maybe design an experiment. Yeah, such a great question. And the last question, where would you like listeners to go to? What work they need to check out? Yeah, maybe your Nest Labs or book or something else. What would you like listeners to, where would you like listeners to go to and check out?
You can go to nestlabs.com if you want to subscribe to my newsletter. I send it every single week and I discuss a lot of the topics that we explored today together. My book, Tiny Experiments, is available anywhere books are sold. And I'm also on social media, mostly these days on LinkedIn and Instagram.
Yeah, and I love like all of your social media, love the book. I highly recommend it and the newsletter. So amazing resources. And again, I feel like that is such a needed resource in our time today when literally very few people know where it's all going, right? And we are all going to be going through so many more transitions and changes without the knowledge, like where are we going to end up and not having the goal and destination. So I highly encourage our listeners to go check out the book, the Nest Labs newsletter, and your social media. And yes, start a tiny experiment and see where it leads. So thank you so much, Anne-Laure, for being such an amazing podcast guest and sharing all of your experiments and wisdom that came out of it.
Thanks for having me.